So today I'm going to talk about the formal lab report process. I'm going to go through the different parts of the rubric, and I'm going to give some specific emphasis as it relates to the titration lab report. So in the beginning, the first thing you should have is the title page. Make sure it has everything listed there on the rubric. Double check that the due date is the final lab report due date. And then you can also have the abstract on the same page at the bottom, or it could be on its own page. Now, what is the abstract? The abstract is the Spark Notes. It's the summary, the quick lookup of what you did in the lab, what you found, and the errors that may have occurred. Right? Make sure you state the results in a succinct way, and then a short bit of information about procedure. If it's a titration, that is a procedure. The error that you include should be correct. It should be a reasonable error that may have occurred during your lab and relate to how the results are. Then you get to a little more substance, the introduction. As it says, it should be more than one paragraph. You can use information from the background info in the lab that was provided to you, but make sure that you go beyond that and you don't just take that information. For the titration lab report, you definitely should have at least an equation. Make sure you number it, and make sure you also discuss it somewhere in words. The introduction is a good place to include some of the pre-lab questions. So things like, what is standardization? What is KHP? Why are we using KHP? What type of things are being titrated or being investigated? How will we do this, both in the lab as well as in the post-lab? What information is going to be necessary? When it says third person, abstract, and introduction, make sure that there's no he, me, we, I, she, you, any people involved. The abstract should be in the past tense. The introduction, you can use whichever tense you would like, just keep it consistent. And then the safety section, really short, 1 or 2 sentences. Make sure you refer to specific compounds or chemicals that are being used in the lab given. Right, in the middle section, we now get to the procedure. For formal lab reports, make sure you write this in paragraph format. That's also in past tense with third person. Right, an example would be 20 milliliters of blank was added to an Erlenmeyer flask. Right, kind of like magic, it happens on its own. Make sure it has all relevant information. You don't need to get super detailed about the whole process of what happened when you clean things. A knowledgeable scientist should be able to repeat. The other thing is, don't give a range. 0.1 to 0.5 grams was used. No, give your exact amount. 0.2581 grams of blank was masked. There were 3 parts to the titration lab report, so make sure you have all 3 sections included. The next part in the results section. This could look different among different lab reports, but in our case we had 3 parts to titration, so there should be just some quick place to look to see what the main 3 findings were. Hint, concentration, part 1, another concentration, part 2, and molar mass and or identity in part 3. Now, in order to reach some of those conclusions, you may have needed something like a titration curve. That would be an excellent thing to also include in results. And then make sure you give a quick summary, a caption for what everything is that you show. Now, calculations, you somehow need them in this lab report, and that was from basically your post-lab calculations. They could be included here in the results. Just make sure it's relevant and easy to follow, or if you have a lot of work, you could put that in the appendix. Now the discussion, you'll notice it's out of 20 points. The discussion is the heart of the lab report. That's where all the important information is going to be. There were 3 parts, so there's kind of 3 purposes. This is where you want to make sure you include all of them. When you discuss what was found, that's essentially where you're stating the information. For parts C through F, I've kind of used those in the titration lab report to correspond with some of the post-lab questions. Right? What is an equivalence point? Explain what that means. How is that different than an endpoint? What do titration curves look like? How do you know where the equivalence point is? How would a strong versus a weak acid be different? So make sure you include that. That might have to do with trends. And then the 2 to 3 sources of error, right? In this case, we did 3 different experiments. So in part 1, for example, we had data points from your classmates. You could compare your data to your classmates and say, hey, I was a little higher. Maybe that's where an error may have come from. Right. In part 2, you compare the actual concentration to what you got. And in part 3, you consider what could have been different with molar masses. Everyone should have been aspirin or at least this year, 2020, everyone should be aspirin. So just make sure your error is correct and makes sense. And then once again, the discussion should be third person, past tense. Formatting, make sure that you use subscripts or superscripts. If you're using Google Docs, it's Control plus or Control comma. And also, if you are writing elements or compounds names, they're lowercase unless it's at the beginning of a sentence. To conclude, the conclusion is not really taking much new information. It's a quick restating of the objective, probably similar to the abstract. The quantitative and qualitative results, in this case we had 3 parts, so you can restate your concentrations and molar masses or identities. And then improvements. Your improvements should probably relate to the error that you discussed in your discussion, but it should be relatively short. When we do our lab reports in the notebooks, usually the conclusions are pretty lengthy, but a lot of this information was already in the discussion. And then this overall part, just use those 5 points to make sure everything's good. If you end up turning in the lab report late, that's where I'll take points off to start, if it's, a day or two. But make sure you get this in on time. It's worth quite a bit. If you have any other questions, let me know.